It's amazing that we have a deal on Churchill Falls and potentially Gull Island, a total of three mega projects, supposedly the historical change of the century for Newfoundland and Labrador, probably more massive than, if Christ himself had reappeared magically on our doorsteps, certainly bigger than Confederation. And yet we spend actually very little time talking about Churchill Falls. I shouldn't say we, I mean the government and the people behind it. Instead, what we've had is this phenomenal discussion about something else. It turns out that Gil Bennett's back at Nalcor, if I understand that correctly. Stand to be corrected on it. I only had one source for this, but it's a source I trust. But then you've got Jennifer Williams going off on a tangent at the hearing, talking about how Muskrat Falls is a great project. Just forget about the money. And then Danny Williams weighed in talking about Churchill Falls, give him full credit for talking about it, and taking some very serious and very obvious issues with the deal. And the government trotted out Andrew Parsons to say, hey, we're trying to clean up Muskrat Falls and making some ridiculous line about criticizing the way he's waving a broom. The problem with Andrew Parsons' comments, of course, is that this government hasn't done anything to make Muskrat Falls better or even not as bad as it was. Since the Liberals took power, they continued the project. They didn't really make any changes. If Dwight Ball had had his way, Ed Martin would have stayed in charge of the project for another 4 or 5 years, or however long it took him to finish the damn thing. Everybody from Nalcor got all the bonuses they were entitled to. There was no fundamental change of anything. And of course, to add insult to injury, as the Liberals claim to have had something to do with making Muskrat Falls somehow better, um, they've delivered us a sham rate mitigation plan that really only lasts until 2030, even though we've got another 40 years, or yeah, we've got another 40 years of payments or 45 years of payments on this damn thing. And one of the reasons is the government couldn't come up with a rate mitigation scheme or couldn't figure out how to pay for the damn thing. And in this particular Churchill Falls deal that Andrew Parsons is so happy about, there isn't enough money to pay for Muskrat Falls, as my regular readers will know. With that opening, welcome to yet another Bondcast, which seems to be going quite well, and people enjoy them. So we're going to talk today about some new information about the deal itself that will help you to understand and will reinforce the point that the initial impression that a lot of us had that this is just 1969 all over again is actually true. Don't forget, there's Muskrat Falls, the mess. And always remember that the people who negotiated this deal are, with a few exceptions, the people who hired Astaldi, a company from Italy that had never done anything in the North at all. And that was just one of many cock-ups that they made. In some respects, what Andrew Parsons said is a bit like Mickey Rooney. We're not going to make that mistake again. And Mickey, of course, said that 8 times as he walked out of divorce court. Yeah, we just keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And until somebody stops us, I guess we're going to keep making them. We talked a bit about the strategic picture for Newfoundland and Labrador over a long period of time in Monday's episode. Today, a couple of things, a lot less because we've already talked about a bunch of things in some of the strategic context and other aspects of the 1969 contract, and already what we could see of this deal. But there are some things I want to highlight for you. Then compared to now, in 1969, Newfoundland and Labrador was geographically trapped. Actually, it was Brinko that was geographically trapped because Quebec wouldn't let the electricity through. We had to sell it to them on the border. Now, Newfoundland and Labrador could theoretically export it if it built transmission or cut a deal like 2005. In 2005, Ontario and Quebec offered Danny Williams a deal in which they would build a plant and we would own it. It was very similar to the way Gull is structured here in some ways, and for some reason he didn't want to do it. He passed over it in favor of something else. That's one little blank spot in my understanding of what's going on because there's not a lot of information available in public. If any of Danny Williams' friends are out there listening to this, or if Danny's listening to himself, I'd love to do a podcast and have a chat with him about that and to talk about the Churchill Falls deal. And that would be a wonderful thing to happen for many people. not the least of whom would be my sister, whose head already exploded on Monday night when she realized that both Danny Williams and I are on the same side of this issue. Um, so, I think that would be fun. We could probably have a good chat. And since we're not really going to talk about Muskrat Falls, we're going to talk about Churchill. Um, we could probably have a rather entertaining time. And I think he does have some useful things to say on this. Um, Go back, though, to this discussion. Alternatives, we were trapped before. We've actually had the stranglehold broken. It was actually broken by the American Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the late 1990s. So we've been able to wheel electricity through. Opted not to do it in 1998 because it was cheaper to just dump the electricity into Quebec for 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And in 2009, Danny Williams conservatives decided they were going to sell it to Emera and paid $19 million in wheeling charges, and it's made a bit of money, but it's not a huge amount. The one thing we know from those earlier tests is that we would have to build power lines through Quebec, either to Ontario or to New England. The thing about it is, though, is that if you go back and look at a deal like 2005, something like that would have been very advantageous to us, and it's possible. And as part of that deal, both Ontario and Quebec offered to build the transmission infrastructure and to also upgrade the interties on the Quebec-Ontario border. So there would have been a greater amount of energy transmission possible if that deal had gone forward. That's another alternative that was possible in this context as we look at the future of energy across the northeast of North America. But that's a possibility. In 1969, though, one of the other elements I wanted to talk about, the big competition for Churchill Falls was nuclear power. Scads of electricity for relatively cheap prices in a relatively long time. And the people behind Brinko, who owned Churchill Falls at the time, managed to figure out a way to grossly undersell nukes, apart from whatever happened in terms of Quebec taking advantage of the situation. And they still made money at it. The thing is, the CFL goes profitable even under the 69 power contract. In the current context, there isn't anything to compete with Churchill Falls. It's like all the big hydro projects in the Northeast, including Bourassa and the other great dams of James Bay. Big old dams that have been paid for that now generate huge amounts of electricity, and their operating costs are trivial. There isn't anything for that. In terms of vulnerability, it's an interesting contrast that in 1967, 68, Brinko got into financial trouble, and that was something that worked heavily in Quebec's favor in determining the shape of the 1969 power contract. But now the shoe is definitely on the other foot, very firmly on the other foot, in a way that I call the 15, 15, and 15. If Quebec doesn't get access to Churchill Falls, it can't replace what is 15% of its core generating capacity for less than about 15 cents a kilowatt hour in less than the 15 years it would take if we simply said, yeah, no, in 2041, contract over, and this electricity is going to go to New England somewhere. And Hydro-Quebec, as a junior partner, would not be able to complain much because they'd be making scads of money through the back door, but it would cause them some problems on the other side. So there's a real difficulty with this, and it's all about Hydro-Quebec. This is one of the reasons why it's very strange to hear some of the things that were said. But think about those things. Think about the other strategic opportunities that are very different today than before. It's one of the reasons why when Danny Williams said the starting position in the negotiations should have been double what's actually on the table here, he's absolutely right. It's extremely cheap amount of money for this, and we played into Hydro-Quebec's hands without really getting anything significant in the trade-off. Because bear in mind, for those who are not familiar with it, the extension projects, and especially Gull Island, because that's the one that we would really expect to go ahead, they're not guaranteed at all, and it's entirely in Quebec's hands to decide what's going to happen. So in this power contract now, these are some of the high points of it. Hydro-Quebec gets almost all Churchill Falls energy at low capped prices for 50 years. It's actually 51 years. Strangely, you've had the Premier and Jennifer Williams, the head of Newfoundland Hydro or Nalcor, now saying that there are no alternatives to this deal. If we don't sign this, there'll be nothing for 17 years, and then we'll be broke, or some other equally crazy phrase. Quebec will just go somewhere else, they said. Where else would they go? I'd like to see somebody show an actual set of credible alternatives to give the equivalent of 30 terawatt hours of electricity a year and anything even vaguely close to the price of what Churchill Falls would give, even at the kinds of prices that people like me have been talking about, 6, 7, 8 cents a kilowatt hour. Um, they don't exist, and anybody who suggests that they do exist is either a fool or doesn't know what they're talking about. In this case, Quebec controls the expansion projects and the project finances, which is what they did in 69. If it's built, it's going to take 65 years to amortize Gull. And if it isn't built, Hydro-Quebec will still retain control over the project effectively for 15 years because CFLCO is, or Newfoundland Labrador Hydro is barred from talking to anybody else about the project. The weakness in this contract that I've already identified, there's no water for Churchill Falls expansion, which was a crucial thing in 1998, and it's the reason why the deal fell apart. That part of the deal collapsed. And as a number of people, I think, including Bill Wells, the former CEO of Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, the real NL Hydro from pre-2003, one of the things he pointed out was that adding more turbines without adding more water simply dilutes the efficiency of the existing plant. So it really doesn't make any sense to do what they're planning to do. And again, if Nalcor and CFLCO have got some engineering that shows how they can make something out of nothing, it would be nice for them to share it with us. We have the concern about Gull, which is a very expensive project, far more expensive than I think a lot of people expect, certainly me, and therefore maybe doubtful that it's going to go ahead. And as I've noted many times, there's not enough money for Muskrat Falls in this project in terms of what's coming out of the Churchill Falls power plant. There's also not enough electricity for Newfoundland and Labrador to meet Nalcor demand forecasts, which would be actually a miracle if they were real, because Nalcor and its predecessor, Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, have a reputation for coming up with all sorts of crazy, ludicrous, nonsensical power forecasts, all to justify the construction of one mega project or another. They've done it consistently since they started looking at Churchill Falls, or sorry, the Lower Churchill dams in the 1970s, and essentially they inherited a kind of mania from Brinko in the takeover in 1975. Remember, I said about how the stranglehold that Quebec had on Newfoundland was broken? Well, guess what, boys and girls? It's back, and we've taken Quebec's hands and placed them around our neck willingly. One of the things that came up in the technical briefing given to MHAs before the debate, the quote unquote debate in the House of Assembly, was that Newfoundland and Labrador will agree not to sell any of its recaptured electricity into Quebec's markets. So that would be Ontario, New York, and New England, which is where we wanted to historically go. Quebec will be the only export market. So if we recapture power or recapture electricity under this agreement, if we're not going to use it in Newfoundland and Labrador, then there's only one place it's going, and that's at the border to Quebec. This is part of the calculation, and this reinforces the point in Dave Réaume's interview with Francis Vai from La Presse that appeared a week ago Monday, that explained a whole bunch of details of the deal that the Nalcor officials here stumbled over themselves to try not to say. So what you essentially have here is a captive market in which Quebec, again, as in 1969, takes virtually all the electricity from Churchill Falls and will pay an incredibly low price for it. For in all practical terms, it's a fixed price contract as it was in 1969. That if that doesn't shock you, that we have agreed not to compete with Quebec, then boy, you're not paying attention. And if you're out there now and your blood pressure is rising, you're definitely old enough to remember what the ambition was before. Go back to what I said before about the difference between are you a wholesaler or are you a retailer? Are you a competitor or are you Hydro-Quebec's little buddy? Well, we're firmly in a little buddy camp these days when you see things like that. And that should upset people a lot. It's not anywhere else. It was said in the briefing. The people who were in the briefing heard it. They know what it means. And it's not written down. But it is true. It is real. Let's see Nalcor refute it. The one thing that we did talk about too, and this is an extra detail that I wanted to add in, another topic we're going to talk about today. I gave you the first little tidbit, which was the stranglehold is back, and we put the hands around our neck. The second one is a little bit of clarification on valuing and pricing. As I've explained before, there were two ways basically to value the electricity from Churchill Falls, and pricing was always an issue from 1969. There are two ways to do it. One is a market valuation in which we base it on some element of the actual market. So, for example, we would say it's the ISO New England hub. Um, we pick one of the indices that they have, or we could pick Hydro-Quebec's average 5 years export price into Quebec into New England, and base it on that. We'd do something that's fixed in the marketplace. It would float over time, and we could play with inflation if we wanted to. If we didn't, or if we didn't, we could just simply fix it in the marketplace and say whatever the market's worth at that time, we'll pick a valuation some way, and that's what the electricity is worth. In this contract, they took essentially a variation on what happened in 1969, and they made up an agreed upon valuation. Actually, just before I started recording this, someone explained to me they figured out how it happened. They took a number, 5.9 cents, 2% escalator, and they came up with a maximum valuation of $33.8 billion valued in now. And they made it up. But the 5.9 was just an assumed number. It actually doesn't work in practice, as you're going to see. And here's how it works. The reality is that there is no actual escalator on paper. It's really just a moving sidewalk, the same as it was before. Um, we know from Dave Réaume's interview with La Presse, the formula will be based 90% on the price of hydro supplies in Quebec, including the Heritage Block. That's 3 cents a kilowatt hour. That's what they're really talking about, 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and 10% on the price of the electricity market in the American Northeast. 90% of the price in the imaginary escalator formula that they may have in the final contract, the price for Churchill Falls electricity would be based 90% on another made up number, which is Hydro-Quebec's domestic price that's set by law under as part of the heritage pool under Quebec law. That's where 97 or 90% of it will come from, and the other 10% will be probably the ISO New England hub price. Which one, we're not sure, but it's one of those. But because it's only 10%, you'll see in a minute that it doesn't matter. Little bit of a disagreement here and I think there's the two, as it was explained to me very shortly, and I'll apologize if I make a mistake on it. In making up the $33.8 billion valuation, there was an allowance for a 2% increase per year in the price as they made up what the price would be. But in practice, in the final version of the contract, you will only see the $33.8 billion 2024 valuation for the total amount of electricity, regardless of how much they buy. And that 2% index doesn't apply in practice in the contract. They only use that to make up the number 33.8, because that's a number that's been bugging somebody. And so after some considerable amount of math, he figured it out. Again, anybody wants to explain it differently from Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, please tell us where that 33.8 billion came from and why it's a fixed valuation. There's also no inflation built into the valuation in whatever scheme they're talking about either, which is another way. And really, the thing to remember is the total amount of that Hydro-Quebec's going to pay for the 51 years of this contract is $33.8 billion in 2024 values. So whatever the number might look like in 2075, it will be figured out in such a way as to make sure that the total value that Hydro-Quebec doesn't pay, it hasn't paid in total, would be over $33.8 billion 2024. This also tells you something else that's really interesting that's been bugging people since last week, and particularly me, which is why is this memorandum of understanding so unbelievably vague about so many things, so many crucial things? And the answer is that the MOU is basically a political document for public consumption that the two parties are putting forward, but it doesn't reflect the real deal accurately, honestly, and clearly. It's in stark contrast to the Muskrat Falls MOU, which was translated from its original version basically into the detailed documents. In this one, there's all sorts of stuff, including the actual amounts of electricity that the parties are going to try to buy from each other or buy from the plant and share amongst themselves. Wasn't in the MOU at all. That only came out later, and there's all sorts of other stuff that came out. But that quote at the top, which is just to show you how the MOU works, that's if that's the actual structure of the formula, good description of it, an accurate description of it. We have no reason to doubt it because it's from a senior Hydro-Quebec official. Then you look at the second quote underneath, reflects a wholesale electricity market value in Quebec, blah, 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 blah. That could mean any of a number of things, and it does capture that, but it's a lot less. It's a lot less. And I'm going to show you a version that also matches that definition, but which would give Newfoundland and Labrador way more money. So, but this vagueness vagueness and inaccuracy about crucial parts of this deal means that oversight by anyone is essentially a joke unless they have the power to compel responses from Nalcor officials and government officials. There's no way you'll know if the final agreements match the MOU or anything else of the sort. So Dennis Brown, love him, hate him, think he's independent, think he's not independent. Dennis has taken a mug's errand or a fool's errand, and he's engaged in a mug's game. Take whatever metaphor you want, because he doesn't accurately know what the MOU is supposed to say. So you can never really say whether or not the government's going to get what it's supposed to get anyway. This is part of the charade, which of course is the House of Assembly last week. What does that moving sidewalk look like? Well, it roots almost all the price in Quebec's politically determined domestic rates, and really the one we should use here is the 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which is the current wholesale rate that Hydro-Quebec Generation charges Hydro-Quebec Distribution to sell into the domestic market in Quebec. So 90% of 3 is 2.7 cents. 10% of the ISO New England day ahead, which yesterday was running about 11 cents a kilowatt hour, would give us 1.1 cents for a total of 3.8 cents. But remember the headpiece of the staff of Raw from Raiders of the Lost Ark. You got to take it back, and that's where the cap comes in. The amount has to fit under that cap. So you may get it some years and you may not get it other years. It depends on how that cap works. And in any event, just to make sure that you understand that that's not the simple and only policy that works, understand that the two companies have already agreed that this year in 2025, Hydro-Quebec will not pay 3.8 cents a kilowatt hour, 3.7 cents a kilowatt hour. They're only going to pay 1.6. And why 1.6, do you say? Well, that's 1969 adjusted for inflation. 0.2 cents a kilowatt hour adjusted for inflation would be 1.6 cents today. So there it is. And that's the start of it. And they have this bizarre Schedule G, which shows this increasing amount of payment, and then it goes across, and then it drops down at the end, so that the amount to be paid at the end is really not much more than is being paid at the beginning. It is not what is being advertised. Hydro-Quebec's agreed to a flat amount of money, and how that gets paid out over the course of the next 51 years is up to whatever. But it doesn't really matter because that's all it is. I did a little revised math myself. My original estimate was roughly 30 terawatt hours a year for 50 years. And that basically, if you do the math on that, it works out to be about 2.2 cents a kilowatt hour. I took into consideration the plans for upgrading Churchill Falls, the original plant, which would give you a slightly increased output in total. Then I divided it, actually 90-10 between, no, I divided it 80-20. Sorry, I did it exactly right. I divided it 80-20 between Hydro-Quebec gets 80% of the output. Newfoundland and Labrador gets 20% of the output. And I assumed that the actual output is about 70% of the nameplate capacity, which is a little bit less than the plant actually produces in terms of annual electricity. And I came up with roughly about 30 terawatt hours a year just by doing simple math and without really knowing what the answer was going to be, which really means it's about 2.2 cents a kilowatt hour on average. It's a lot less than 3. It's a lot less than 3.8. What that would mean for practical terms for Newfoundland is in a typical year where they actually got 2.2 cents a kilowatt hour, and they use 30 terawatt hours, it's about $662 million paid to CFLCO, of which 65% would theoretically come somehow back to the Newfoundland government. So that's only about 430 million. Only the Quebec payments are considered in here. Don't forget Churchill Falls also, Hydro or Newfoundland Labrador Hydro also buys from Churchill Falls, but that's not really the money where people are interested in. What would a real escalator look like? Well, first of all, there'd be no cap. We just fix a price, and that's the price you pay. That's it. And it goes up and down with the market. Some years it's up, some years it's down, and over time it works out to be whatever it is. But if we did it on the basis of 90% of the price was, say, New England's Hydro-Quebec's New England export price for the preceding 5 years, with 10% based on its wholesale rate. We flipped around the one that's actually in this agreement so far. You'd wind up with about 5.7 cents a kilowatt hour. Magic. And if you did that for 51 years, you'd be looking at this year, for example, something more like $1.7 billion to CFLCO. The net cost of actually about 1.1 to Hydro-Quebec. But look at this. Newfoundland and Labrador's dividend, $1.1 billion. It's almost 4 times, sorry, almost three times what this deal delivers just by applying that 6 cent number, 5.96 cents, in a slightly better way, which should have been possible given the political and strategic circumstances between Newfoundland and Labrador and Hydro-Quebec. So yeah, and even if you split the difference between the price they're getting and something along Danny Williams' line, which is instead of 34 billion, pay me twice that, you'd be getting closer into the realm of possibilities. But we are just so far off the mark in this deal, and it's such a puny amount of money that it beggars the imagination to figure out how they came up with it. That's my second thing. The first thing was about how we put the strangle back around our own necks, put the noose back around our own necks. The second thing was to confirm that, yep, this is fixed price contracting, and the government's been misrepresenting this up, down, and sideways. Third thing is an interesting exchange that happened on Wednesday night when the JP Morgan folks were given a few hours to talk about money. Now, take a break for a second, take a breath, and think about that. This deal's all about money. The biggest part of the problem with this has been about money. And yet, out of the 4 days in the House of Assembly, from 10 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night, 4 days in a row, grueling, completely unnecessary, brutal process in which it was more painful to watch and go through than it was to go through. Sorry, more painful to go through, and it was torturous to watch. And it didn't necessarily improve anybody's great understanding of this project one way or the other, except for those of us who were already looking at it. They put the finance guys on, and at one point, Fred Hutton, who is now the Minister of Infrastructure and Public Works, asked a question. He said to the guys from JP Morgan who have been advising Nalcor, Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, would you feel comfortable telling taxpayers that this is a good deal? And the CEO of JP Morgan Canada said, well, and this is a literal quote, while I would love to address the question, it's really out of our scope as it relates to this mandate. In other words, not what they were paid to do. They weren't paid to advise on whether or not this was a good contract or a bad contract. They just did some other kind of advice. And he said, I do feel the question is probably more appropriate for either Walter, meaning Walter Parsons, representing the company, or maybe in a different form. And that wasn't necessarily what Fred was looking for, because there was some consternation or some activity and communication that appeared to be going on back and forth between somebody in the gallery and the folks on the floor from JP Morgan. So Fred went off and asked something else, which is, so how is it that, and he asked a bunch of things related to the way the asset is going to be treated here, which is Gull Island. If Hydro-Quebec is giving us Newfoundland and Labrador the money to for our equity position in this project, and Hydro-Quebec's going to finance it all. How is it, Fred asked, that a jointly held corporation, jointly held by Hydro-Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, is going to own Gull Island, but is not going to pass on any related debt to the taxpayers of Newfoundland and Labrador? This time, Konstantin Akimov, managing director of JP Morgan International, explained it out in a variety of ways. He talked about this as a very normal thing to happen. And he said the lenders will take security in the assets. So if something goes wrong, they'll take the assets of the project, meaning the Gull Island plant. But they will not go after the shareholders or the taxpayers for that matter. See what I'm talking about? See where I'm going? It's not going to be our plant, or it might not be our plant. There is a risk. And we need to be very careful in this contract about that particular clause. And we have to be very careful about it because it was actually one of the reasons why in 2002, 2003, the deal that Roger Grimes and his government negotiated with Hydro-Quebec for Gull Island came apart politically. Two directors of Newfoundland Labrador Hydro, Dean McDonald is the chair, and Mark Dobbin, I believe it was, Mark Dobbin, had some serious problems with it. And one of them was a clause in the contract that said if this project runs into problems, runs into financial problems, um, then the financer will take it. The lender will take it. And the lender was going to be, and the way that particular contract worked out, it's going to be Hydro-Quebec. And there would be a question in this case to make sure that Hydro-Quebec is not the lender. In this case, that the borrowing is all from third parties. Because if Hydro-Quebec is going to finance the project and it's going to be their money, guess what, boys and girls? It's not too hard to imagine a situation in which this very expensive, very difficult project gets up and running and then runs into problems so that the clause is triggered and suddenly it's not our project anymore. And so we could wind up with maybe Hydro-Quebec or possibly the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund or some other third-party holder, some other third-party lender who would wind up owning this project. So there are a bunch of technical issues that we need to get at in behind this. That's the message here. There are some really complicated financial management issues that need to be looked at here. Control of the assets, long-term valuation, who actually does own it, and to make sure that its value and its value to us as an asset in Newfoundland and Labrador is actually ours and is properly recognized financially, and that we are insulated not only from the risk of it going bad, but what happens if it goes bad, and to make sure that we don't lose the asset that is actually ours. This is one of many projects, and it raises a question about the role of organizations like JP Morgan, and it raises a question about the legal aspect of this, but also about the financial aspect, which has to be dealt with as well. And there is another implication in this, if you look at what JP Morgan actually said here, that if determining the value of this deal, whether it's a good deal or a bad deal, was outside the scope of work, you got to wonder what basis Akimov offered a very different opinion from the guy who was actually providing the direct advice here, or what happened for that matter between in the 3 or 4 minutes that they were talking about this other issue. Because Fred Hutton goes back after he riffs on this other issue for a minute. He goes back to ask the question again. So is this a good project? And this time it's Akimov who leans in and says, yeah, it's a great project. No explanation of why it happened, but also no discussion of this. These are two incredibly important issues, and the contradiction within JP Morgan about whether or not this is a good deal. Why it is the second time that Akimov gave the political answer that the government needed to help sell the project was the one he got a chance to answer again, even though there was a completely different answer given the first time. That was actually more truthful, I think, and more accurate and more honest, and reflected the role that JP Morgan actually played here, which was probably not the fulsome role they should have played to produce a better contract. bearing in mind the imbalance in experience between the folks on Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro side in negotiating these kinds of contracts, let alone three times these kinds of contracts, and the folks in the case of Hydro Quebec who do this kind of stuff for breakfast and for whom these amounts of money and these long-term projects, these power purchase agreements are second nature. This was a real mismatch in many respects, and I think this does reveal it. So at the end of the day, we have a fixed low price contract, and I explained how this works and how the supposed escalators that appear to be in this contract that people have talked about actually aren't escalators at all. They're just simply meaningless words on a page. It's an incredibly long term in which Quebec options most of the electricity. Most likely, what's going to happen is that Hydro Quebec's going to get about 30 terawatt hours or more of electricity out of the plant. And Newfoundland may recapture more electricity at some point, but it's going to be barred from, by its own choice, doing anything except selling it. So the more electricity that Hydro-Quebec gets, the less it will actually pay for it on on a unit basis because of that $33.8 billion cap. It doesn't matter whether they take a little bit of electricity or a whole big bunch of electricity, they'll still pay only the same total fixed price. And that's how they recreated 1969 somehow. And as I say here at this point, Newfoundland and Labrador somehow has trapped itself, ignored alternatives, rushing needlessly with a no-compete clause. The shadow of the vampire, the 1969 contract, is still very much with us. The shadow of Muskrat Falls is very much with us. The government in this project has been even more secretive, less forthcoming with information than was true in the case of Muskrat Falls, to our detriment. And I've highlighted here three new things that I think people should take notice of. First of all is the non-compete, the effective non-compete clause. It won't be phrased like that in order to skirt FERC rules, but essentially allowing that we're only going to ever sell our electricity from this plant to Quebec again is absurd at best. But somebody does need to explain why that's true, because we have no reason to believe it's not true. We were told, the public, or at least the political officials were told this, MHAs and some of their advisors and political staff were told this by Nalcor officials. So it is presumably true, otherwise they were lying to us. It wasn't misunderstood. It was clear as a bell. People know what it meant. There will be a block on selling Churchill Falls electricity to anybody other than Quebec. Second thing is there is a fixed price valuation on this. And given the operations of that first part, that stranglehold again, Hydro-Quebec stands to get even more electricity than it's actually written on paper, with the assumptions that some of the numbers that have been circulating over the last week or so, simply because in most instances, Newfoundland and Labrador won't have the money, won't have the local need for it, won't have the domestic need, and wouldn't have the ability to be able to move it anywhere else anyway. The most they could do is build another LIL to move it onto the island. Uh, will that be necessary? Again, I said it facetiously earlier. If Newfoundland Labrador Hydro's um, forecasts are true, odds are they're not. They've been notoriously bad at forecasting, so the odds are that most of that 1990 megawatts of power, or the 11 terawatt hours of electricity that apparently goes with that, most of it won't be coming here. Most of it will be going to Quebec. And in the third case, we have the example of how much this thing was a put on, with that little exchange between Fred Hutton and the people from J.P. Morgan. The whole show last week was a put on. But ultimately, though, we did find in the middle of it another issue, one of many issues that the government and its advisors need to be very mindful of, which is answering this question about, at the end of the day, in the worst case scenario, if something goes wrong with Gull Island as it's going ahead, who's going to wind up owning it? Because as it stands right now, the typical thing would be is whoever is the lender would be the one to take those assets as security. It's the same as if you mortgage your house and you don't pay your mortgage on your house, the bank gets it. Except in this case, if Hydro-Quebec is the lender, is there a clause that will preclude Hydro-Quebec from seizing the asset? because this was a major issue in 1960, in 2002, 2003. I would suggest to you that it's an even bigger issue today. And while it may not be politically as sensitive now as it was 20 years ago, 23 years ago, um, it actually is an incredibly, incredibly important thing. That's it for me in another rapid fire Bondcast. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so, or share with your friends. And also don't forget to send me a message via jungle drums, smoke messages, Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky. You can also find me in email or get me through the Substack app. Send me along some more questions. I've answered one of them that I got in this, but I'm going to try to do a live stream either on Substack or Twitter X/X sometime in the next week or so, where we'll answer the questions I've gotten, um, have um, have an opportunity for you to ask other questions as they come up between now and then. And if I have any guests that I need to line up or people I want to line up, then we'll have a chat with that as well. And I was serious, by the way. I wasn't joking about Danny. Um, any of you who know Danny Williams personally, tell him that I'm more than happy to talk to him. And it's very easy to set up a Zoom call, and we can have a grand chat one night, and it'll be probably the most entertaining thing you've seen in a very, very long time. Anyway, that's it for me. I'm Ed Hollett. This is Robert Bond Papers, the Bondcast. See you back here again on Friday morning.